I'm Wild Bill. It's the 22nd of October, 2022, and I would like to tell you a monster story. That's right, it's the time of the season. So let's talk about monsters today. Since Eshkalar has disappeared and there's no evidence he's going to return, I'm going to have to take over the business of the important addenda to his Mything Persons series. And this is one of these. In this case, I'm going to talk about dragons, and I'm not going to talk about Chinese dragons, which come from misinterpreting the evidence of the fossil record. I'm not going to talk about Jormungandr, which again is exactly misinterpreting the fossil record. Lack of knowledge. I mean, people are trying as hard as they can with the intellectual and the scientifical tools of the time, but you can only go so far if your knowledge base is incomplete. That has grave implications for today's science and technology. Anyway, dragons. I'm going to spin you a tale today. One of my ancestors was a knight on crusade. Well, to be a crusading knight, you either were lucky and got a boat ride, in which case you probably got scurvy and were health impacted the rest of your life, or you marched along the coast of the Mediterranean and almost anything could happen to you there, including a lot of novel and interesting diseases that you had no immunogens against. However, crossing the Dardanelles, crossing the Straits of the Bosphorus, would take a ferry. You couldn't walk. So to cross into the Holy Land, because many lands are holy. The Aztecs believed that they were on Holy Land. The Han believed they were on Holy Land. The Japanese still believe that they're on Holy Land. So there are a lot of peoples, a lot of cultural traditions, a lot of perhaps national traditions that synchronize ancient gods and heroes with the modern day land, country, or people. However, the idea of a dragon, the dragon that we have in our Western conception, is so easy to explain. And everything that does not fit in to the explanation is indeed additive. Is material that was just tacked on by people that had an idea and they wanted that to go. Oh, spikes, spikes. I always wanted to see something with spikes. They draw it with spikes. Oh, wings, wings. Everything should have wings. So, because they were doing that back then. In the 1300s, everything had wings. They're drawing angel wings on everything or bat wings on everything. Go look at the drawings. A lot of it survives. But let me go back to this. My ancestors on crusade. Now, he's crossed into the Holy Land, and he is moving into what is, according to Terry Gilliam, who did a wonderful series on this, desert. Very little water. You have to know somebody to know where the water is. And that was tough to do because you're an elitist Christian-themed night, and so what you really wanted to do is beat up people and take their stuff, and you wanted to do it saying that you were a good and proper Christian, so you kind of pointed at people that didn't look like good and proper Christians to you, and doggone, there were a lot of those in the Holy Land. Wow. People that followed different philosophical structures based in the same book, but you were not that complex a person, and that was left to the Pope to figure that stuff out, and he obviously couldn't either because he sent you down here to go to war with people that were preserving the traditions, not destroying them, that legitimately owned the land, and the Crusaders didn't. So they were waging aggressive war for the accumulation of treasure, and in most cases profiting the Pope back home, who got a wonderful, huge chunk of money out of all this, and lands. Wow. And the popes, of course, manipulated the narratives of the times in order to get people interested in going to this place where people died and killing other people and taking their stuff and bringing a large percentage of, at least 10%, back to him because he needed that money for something. You know, God couldn't give him money for some reason. I don't get that. I mean, he wasn't doing any work for it. But they were giving him tons of money, and he was saying that God had told him to tell them to do that. So in the papistry, God enfranchised absolute unrepentant greed, elitism, destruction of native cultures, everything that we would consider bad today unless we saw a buck in it. So that's what it was. The Crusades were the continuation of economic negotiation by other means. To paraphrase Mrs. Clausewitz, it wasn't Clausewitz that wrote a lot of that stuff, it was his wife, who was a brilliant mind herself. People should look into that. He wasn't alive for von Krieg. She is the one that wrote von Krieg from his notes. Amazing woman. Whew. Glad I'm alive today, but kind of wish I'd known her. Imagine the intellectual companionship that people like that could provide you if you were an inquiring mind and wanted to know more about your world, its history, its potential future, its appurtenances, its structures, its cultural means. My ancestor had to march by day, could be, but I think a lot of the marches took place at night in the Holy Land, in that Holy Land, the southern and eastern Mediterranean Holy Land, because it gets very hot in the daytime, especially during campaigning season, which is the summer, late spring, summer, and early fall. A little odd there because I think in Tunisia they have terrible rains. You know, they have kind of like the opposite rain thing going. So they're having terrible rains in, what, March through May. That changes the campaigning season, of course. But in general, you're in a very arid land. It's extremely hot in the daylight. And you're probably, this is considered anathema to people that accept the standard narrative, you're probably not in armor. Because it's 110 degrees out there, in the shade, and you're out there wearing metal armor? No, you're not. You're out there wearing whatever robes that you can learn will cut that huge, enormous heat that'll kill you otherwise. And all the people in that area have learned these same tricks. That's where Frank Herbert got the ideas for his desert people in Arrakis and their outfits that saved every erg of energy, every drop of water for reuse by the wearer. And that is the logical, well, the semi-logical evolution of these ideas, of these multi-layered outfits that are even today still worn by inhabitants of the region. As a matter of fact, to the exclusion of much else, unless you have access to air conditioning, and then more Western attire can take over. But the bulk of the Middle East was not then, and certainly still is not, air conditioned. So these knights were not armored while they were on the march. And it's likely because of the heat and the lack of water that they weren't riding their horses either. Everybody just went walking. And your squire, your page, you had attendants if you were a knight. If you were a low-born knight, man at arms, you may not have too much going for you. But if you were a moderately well-born knight, you had attendants, a retinue, and one of those would be walking your horse, and then the rest of them would be pushing a wagon, and the wagon would have, like rickshaws or whatever, and those wagons would have the knight's gear in them. And some of those retainers, if you had enough, would be carrying weapons to guard from bandits on the road. Now, people have this picture of all the knights in armor marching across the desert. You're not thinking. You're accepting a narrative that was based on people that weren't thinking. They were back in Europe somewhere where it was comfortable, thinking like, oh yeah, we can all just ride across the plains in our armor. No, you can't. You die. So no, there were no knights in armor, big shiny helmets and big gleaming metal carapaces marching across the Holy Land on their way to steal Jerusalem back from the invaders, who by then were the inhabitants. Anyway, and I'm going to paint a slightly different picture than is presented to you in every single movie you've ever seen. They're all liars. I tell you this all the time. Hollywood lies. It doesn't know how to tell the truth because it's invested in narratives, not truths. That's why documentaries from Hollywood are dramatic rather than accurate, because they don't even understand what they're trying to get at. They only know manipulation. They can't. Hollywood's a propaganda arm. Yes, it is. Go back and look at every war. You'll see that the movies are, and the songs are. So yeah, they're all just, they're maintained in existence so that when we need to have a patriotic fervor, there they are, an established network. Kind of like you don't want BEA or Grumman to go out of business because, you want someone to be able to produce the sinews of war for the times, the claws and the weapons of war for the times when you got to go. So here are these knights riding across the Holy Land, and they're not dressed in carapace armor. Absolutely not. 1160, 1180, 1190. Nobody had any armor like that. Everybody's wearing coats of chain or studded leather, which is basically, a heavy leather tunic and pants into which somebody had hammered, crimped or whatever rivets, pointy rivets. So you had pointy rivets all over your leather coat. And there was another kind, scale mail, which was literally leather scales. Some of them had little metal sheaths on them. Some of them were metal scales woven onto a boiled leather or supple leather carapace. But these guys weren't armored like you think they are from the movies. They were armored like a coat of chain, down to here, split on the sides, split in the middle if you were a knight that had a horse, because you had to sit on your horse. Yeah. And at this period, you're having what's called the Tavern Period. So a knight wore his heart on his sleeve. Not exactly, but that's a cute way to couch it. The knight would wear a tabard, which was a long, straight piece of cloth, right? Long, skinny rectangle. And there was a hole in the middle. He put his head through the hole, and there'd be a flap down the front and a flap down the back. Often a colored border, red or blue or whatever color was available, depending on how much money you had and who was doing the work for you. And then there would be a blazon in it somewhere. There would be the symbol of your order if you were a Templar, or the symbol of your house if you were a noble knight, or if you ascribed to a kingdom's ethic, and as a local noble you were pledged to your baron, and the baron was pledged to the king, and so by inference you were pledged to the king. What happens when your baron and the king are disagreeing? This is why feudalism doesn't work. So my ancestor is down there, probably marching at night, which means very slow. And the horse is just plodding along, and the squire's leading the horse. And you're tired, because even though you're young and strong, your diet's not very good. Look back on the diets that we're eating then, and then try to integrate that with today's understandings of dietary science, and you'll see what I mean. And granted that every single one of these people was so riddled with parasites from not boiling water that they were at about 2/3 of their ability and malnourished, about 1/3 of their ability. So people that say, oh, they were tougher and stronger than we were, so you don't understand that, are completely bollocksed. They're complete liars. Today's person is better nourished. Today's person is better taken care of. Today's person is stronger, faster, all those things, because the science says he is. Not because your dreams of knights in armor being able to do all the things that you realize that you can't do in those same things, which means that your concepts about them are flawed, not that they were Superman. Golly, I'm surprised that otherwise educated people are so readily accepting of false narratives to the point where even their minds are turned off. Oh, knights in full carapace armor riding across the desert in the Holy Land in big lines. Yeah, where are people drinking? Where are the toilets? Where are the... Knight never took off his armor. Yes, he did. Knight didn't wear his armor. My premise is the knight didn't wear his frickin' armor. The reason you see big lines of knights in the drawings and paintings, exactly like you do today. Everybody that an artist draws has the best weapons, the most modern stuff, some even science fiction stuff, because they wanted to have more impact and to be more interesting, to create a visual narrative, Hollywood. That's why we believe this bullshit. And it is bullshit. Nobody rides across the Holy Land in a suit of armor all day long, day and night, day and night, day and night. Never takes it off. To believe that is a form of credulity bordering on idiocy. Sorry to say it, but it's true. You guys start studying your topic instead of just accepting some book you read on it. There's huge amounts of data that you can look into, starting with the Royal Armories. So, check those. And then don't say, oh, I read some popularist coverage and I'm now an expert. Because if that's the case, I'm a bigger expert than you are, because I read all the popularist coverages for 60 years, and you've only got 5 or 6 years in. So no, you don't have enough time and rate to claim that the things you read are true. You better start studying all the sources and not just one and say, oh, look at the pretty pictures. Now I know. We have huge misconceptions based on that ready acceptance of Hollywood's narrative by movies and illustrations. I have a lot to say on this, I'm sorry. I don't want to bore you too much, but this is important stuff to me. I'm going to go back to my ancestor again. He's riding along, no, he's walking along, because remember, it's very hot in the Holy Land, even at night. So he's walking along, and if it's the right season, it's cold at night, he's wearing a woolen gambeson. And his armor is being pulled on a wagon or carried on pack horses, and his steed is in a light blanket being led by whoever his man-at-arms is, squire. And the knight himself is armed, and perhaps if he has a larger retinue, he has other armed men with him, likely with spears, maybe one with a bow or a crossbow. But he himself is not an archer. The knights of England were not archers, at least at this period, from what I understand. The Saracen knights were archers. And that brings us into a difference between how the armored knights of the two forces, the Europeans and the Middle Easterns, how they were different. The European knight was a shock troop. He was meant to create vast holes in the enemy line so that reinforcements and further troops could rush through, split the enemy into small pockets that could be readily dealt with. The Saracen, or the Middle Eastern knight, was horse artillery. He was an archer first, and his horse was lighter, and his armor was lighter, because mobility was his saving grace. Whereas for the Western knight, invulnerability was his saving grace, and even so, crossbows could punch a hole in any armor of the time. And it's always been like that. So people that say, oh, the armor was for blah, 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 for blah, 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 I think they're mistaken. Also, my belief is that armor just identified you as a noble, so that when they knocked you off your horse, or they knocked you down to the ground, and they were all standing around you with bodkin knives and, and spears and stuff looking for the chinks in your armor, that you would live long enough to say, ransom, ransom, I'll pay ransom. And they would stop and they would take you prisoner. This was the whole purpose of knightly armor. Now, warriors had less than knightly armor. And in the Crusades, even a knight only had a coated chain, a metal helm, chain mitts, a tabard. If it's a coated chain without pants, it's split down the middle if you're a horseback rider, split at the sides if you're a man at arms, if you're walking. Straight leg infantry, as we call it. So, all those pictures we have of these lines of knights, and all in the best possible 15th century armor, and all with the best possible, everybody with a lance, and no sense given to the balance of forces of the times, because the artists weren't there. The artists were painting these beautiful pictures commissioned by nobles that wanted to see a lot of top quality armor. It's like porn. Think about it. So that was a false narrative carried through by the chroniclers, who were paid by the nobles to talk up the nobles. And so we have this concept that great families and great names drove history, when they didn't. They merely caused the great catastrophes. They did not benefit society in any possible way. In fact, they were parasites of the worst order. Getting back to my story. Oh, and their armor was merely so they would survive long enough to go like, I'll pay your ransom, don't kill me, please don't kill me. That's what knights were for. People like project him as this like Superman that's not afraid of crossbows, not afraid of enemy spears or spearmen stabbing his horse. And now he's on the ground, and his horse is on him. He's like this, going like this, in 60 pounds armor. And the peasants are coming up. He's like, wait, ransom, I'll pay your ransom. Oh, I promise. Yeah. So this is why I do these blogs. This is why I'd asked Eshkalar to begin his series, because so many of our misconceptions are so pervasive that we believe things that if we were parents and our kids came to this with them, we'd say like, who's teaching you this bullshit? But instead we accepted it ourselves as young minds, and now we don't think discriminatingly about it. We don't think like, is that true? Wait, what? See what I mean? So, my ancestors' column, he's in a column, probably other knights, other men at arms, horses being led. Nobody's riding a horse in the middle of the night, in the middle of the Holy Land, when it's either extremely hot at night or extremely cold at night. Nobody's riding a horse. Everybody's walking, including the horses. And nobody's armored either, because armor is a huge drain on a person that's already rife with parasites and extensively malnourished. And I don't know why anybody doesn't get that. Oh no, it wasn't like that. I have this dream. Yeah, everybody has a dream. I have a dream that I'm a telekinetic. Do you believe that? No, because it's patently stupid to believe that. So let's go back and look at this narrative too, which is patently stupid to believe. The knights are in armor all the time, they never took it off. That they rode that armor across the Holy Land in the blazing sunlight, 110, 120 degrees Fahrenheit. You're not thinking. That's called an oven. That's called an oven, and it's used to bake things. Big piece of metal around a piece of meat in the blazing heat of the desert sun. That's an oven. So anyway, and so by the time you get anywhere, if you were like that, you would be dehydrated as well as being parasite ridden, as well as being excessively and extensively malnourished, even if you were a noble. What were the fads of the times? Oh yes, sugar was a fad of the time. Everything was sugar, because it was like new. And so they were all rotten teeth, and I know what that's like. I drank Pepsi all my life. That didn't make me a stronger, faster, more intelligent, or more resilient person. So yeah, these guys were all in bad shape. And the knights just happened to be the nobles that were in bad shape, and they were suffered from fad diets just like everybody did then, and just like everybody does today on some level or other. Almost everybody suffers from fad diets. So we have this thing called the obesity epidemic. And then fad diets. Oh, you can just keep doing what you want, and then fix it easy, and then you'll be able to go back to your life. No. When a doctor comes to you and says, you have screwed yourself up by doing this thing really badly, that means you can't go back to it, ever. Your life has to change. And the doctor may or may not have the way, because doctors aren't perfect, and medical science isn't complete, and there's still a lot of gaps. And fads, and common memes, and narratives in medicine. This is all part of human nature, not about the disciplines themselves, not about the history itself, about human nature and how humans are always human, no matter where you go, no matter what period of time or level of technology you want to examine. There is no perfect human that just like follows everybody slavishly and obeys daddy all the time. There are individuals creating a society that is a balance of tensions and about to fall apart at any given time. And that's not conducive to mass production of similar suits of armor, shields, crests, weapons. Matter of fact, it is the opposite of conducive to mass production of similar and same weapons and armor. So you don't have vast armies of knights and everybody's in plate armor. You don't have vast armies of knights and everybody's in chain. Most people are just peasants dragging along, malnourished, parasite ridden, and they got a bill hook. They got like something they used to cut tree branches at home. And if they're lucky, their Lord says, here's a helmet for you, leather helmet, put it on. Maybe you'll stop an arrow. It'll deflect an arrow that wasn't going to kill you, the way that today's helmets will deflect flechettes and shrapnel that isn't going to kill you, isn't coming directly on. Anything like that will penetrate these helmets. And in the past, the steel wasn't very good. No? Yeah. As a matter of fact, metallurgy was basically praying to the gods or the demons or the Tengu until well after 1600. So barbarian armor, what we call barbarian armor, Viking armor, wasn't good. It was terrible. Old English armor, terrible. Saracen armor, terrible. Chinese armor, terrible. Any of the metal was terrible. Japanese armor, Japanese were bright in that way because they would lacquer all their little millions of little squares of armor, little rectangles of armor with like a hole or a couple holes in the top, and they were, iron. Iron rusts like crazy, and it's gone in a couple of years, especially Japan where it's wet, wet, wet all the time. So they would lacquer it, and it was waterproof now. How about that? Then they would use silk ropes to tie them together and tie them onto frameworks, tie them onto leather backing if you were that kind of Japanese. Not all were. Buddhism was kind of against leather, but by the same token, a lot of things used in Buddhism were leather, so like I said, it's a bunch of things pulling, tensions pulling back and forth. It's no uniformity in the past, barely uniform in the present, and we have broad sweeping laws and tendencies and the television and the internet to carry narratives forward, which they didn't have in the past. So we're much more uniform and homogenous today than ever we could have been in the past when news was spotty and populations were greatly isolated. And that when you travel between two populations, differing populations, you brought a disease with you, and it wasn't good. And if you went home, you brought a new disease with you. And that's where the plague epidemics came from. Merchants that couldn't keep their financial penis in their financial pants. I need more, I need more, I need more. I have to sit atop the system. That kind of insanity is what promulgated all the great plagues, including Hernan Cortez, who single-handedly brought venereal disease to the New World and caused untold destruction. His military might was very small, but his might of disease, the power of biohazard coming off of Cortez like a miasma from the swamp, was immense and powerful. So my ancestor, who's not in very good shape, and at 26, he's getting pretty old, because he'll be dead by the time he's 35 probably. If he's lucky, he might live to be 50 or 60, but he'll be broke down. There's only one guy that lived a long time and still rode out in armor in all of European history, and he's still held up as like the shining example. It's not like the other ones did it. And this guy, I'm guessing that they bolted him to his horse and he rode out like this. Because he's getting old, man. And he was parasite ridden. There was nobody that was not parasite ridden in those days. And parasites, go to Africa and see whole tribes of people that are like this because they got that trichinosom. And they've got sleeping sickness. And they're like, yeah. And they do their job and they go through their day at about a third or maybe a half of what they would if they weren't infested with this tryptosome, I think it's called. Right? So imagine that person healthy and hale. And they'd be alert and functional. But today, because of sleeping sickness, they're like this. And they go through their job like an automaton. I mean, they're still human, but they're severely affected by a parasite. And it's not the only parasite. There are parasites in the water, in the blood of insects, saliva of mosquitoes. Parasites. Many of them love humans because we're big and warm. Parasites like that. Tapeworms in your brain, that happens. So anyway, hope it doesn't happen to you or me, but still it does happen. Because you can't tell a tapeworm, oh, this is where you're supposed to be in the human body. No, a tapeworm goes, hey, look, here's another place full of blood. Let's go here. And many times they end up in your brain because they can't go any farther. Dunk, dunk, dunk. Ow, what's that sound? So anyway, the column with my ancestor in it pulls up to a river. There are rivers in the Levant, obviously, right? So it pulls up to a river. And we, my ancestor stands by his horse, send a page forward to search for a ford, right? So, page or a couple of pages, and people, peasants from the column, they come forward, they break left and they break right and walk along the riverbank there to look for a shallow spot, somewhere to cross maybe, right? This is a very slow process, and it's taking place at night, and nobody's armored. And only a few people are carrying weapons. The terrified, which means the intelligent, are carrying weapons, and are probably close to whatever wagon or horse their armor is on. But they're not wearing it. You can't. You can't wear your armor 24/7. All these lovely depictions we have online, and people say, "Look how light this is! I could roll in this armor. I can," are from well-nourished, parasite-free people that only do it on camera for a very short time. No, they're not marching through the Holy Land wearing that armor. They aren't fighting in that armor. They aren't on the track at night in that armor. This is why I say these people are promoting a false narrative. Metatron, I'm looking at you. You're brilliant. You stole Enoch's name. Go right ahead. I mean, everybody steals something. But your ideas about honorable and armored chivalry are entirely false and based on false pretext. So, the knight, the Western knight, was his nation's, his force's shock infantry, shock cavalry, I guess you'd say. It is the shock force. So these are the guys that would ride in to break holes in enemy lines of, the spear lines. There's a lot about this too. Metatron doesn't believe anyone would kill a horse. He completely ignores the fact that the battlefield is full of arrows killing horses all the time. Duh. Duh. The main weapon of any medieval combat was the arrow or the bolt. It wasn't the lance or the sword or the shield. And it isn't today. We don't have mighty robots with axes on them doing this in the battlefield. We have standoff artillery. That's right. And that's what knights were. If they were smart in the old days, they'd be lightly armored, light horsed, very maneuverable, very knowledgeable about the terrain and the water sources. Horsed artillery. That's what the Saracens were known for. Whereas the Western knights were heavy shock cavalry. And that means they're slow. They require a huge amount of support, like way out of proportion to the work they do. I mean, look at the classic accounts of the combat in the Middle East. They don't talk about the knights much. They talk about being fallen upon and destroyed in detail. They talk about the sieges. They don't talk much about armored knights because they weren't. And those that had armor had chain, coats of chain. Coats of chain are very good against some things, but not all that good against a lot of things. A mace will hurt a person in a coat of chain. A spear will still pierce a person in a coat of chain. Arrows will go right through it. So, I mean, if you're a big, slow guy and you're parasite-ridden and you're malnourished and you're barely making it, chain is good stuff because it stops a lot of battlefield. It stops like a helmet does. It stops like stuff that's lost enough energy to not penetrate, which is a goodly bit of stuff that might wound you otherwise. And in those days, wounds were what killed you. Many, many accounts from the Crusades and all through medieval Europe about what happened when somebody got wounded and it festered. King Henry VIII, one of the big ones, and that changed all of world history because he was a jerk. Like I says, the great families merely cause the catastrophes. They do not benefit or aid society or build it in any way. They try to destroy it as hard as they can, and grassroots people keep it together. That is the history of mankind, entirely. In a nutshell, and everyone tries to promote these narratives to make their favorites seem more important. No. No knight could build a castle without civilian help. No knight could feed himself in a castle without civilians growing the stuff for him. Knights didn't grow their own food. Knights didn't make their own armor. Knights weren't the blacksmiths. Knights weren't the miners. Knights weren't the information gatherers. Knights weren't the people that made and broke treaties. All these were done by professionals. The knight was basically a shock cavalry. And shock cavalry doesn't have to be too smart. It just has to last long enough to go like, please, quarter, save me. So I can go home and steal my dad's land off my younger brother, or my older brother, when I get back, because now I'm a hero, which was the point. The crusading knights were sometimes first sons, but in general, you'd become you'd be a second or a third son, and primogeniture would take your lands away from you. They would go to your older brother, your older whatever sibling was in the line of succession, and you would get very little. If you were lucky, you get a suit of armor, maybe a horse, and so you kind of have to take it from there yourself. Which is why most knights were poor until they finally found a sponsor. And if you and your dad weren't getting along, you weren't going to find a sponsor at home. Right? Oh, Daddy, the sunlight on the moors is so beautiful. I have to sing. There'll be no singing in this castle, lad. There's a lot of that going on, I bet. Because the kids, if you were the son of a nobleman, you saw fine wines being drunk and sugared plums and sugared pork and all this beautiful food and drink and women available to you. And think rock star. Think the children of rock stars. They kind of go off the handle because they didn't have to work for it themselves. They didn't have to fight tooth and nail to keep it themselves. They aren't the hard-nosed, hard-assed, fighting, scrabbling monsters that their parents were forced to become. So they don't understand. They don't understand the purpose. They don't understand the ends. They just understand that they have access now. And so I'm thinking that it was like that in those days as well. Kids have access. So they're going to eat all the sugary stuff, eat only what they like, and that means they're going to be sufficiently malnourished that they won't be anything like a modern person for endurance or strength or speed. It's all dependent on having sufficient neurotransmitters, and that's part of diet. Yeah, you guys pretty much spreading false narratives. So anyway, you got peasants with torches going upstream, peasants with torches going downstream, looking for a way to cross that river at night in the Holy Land. And sunrise is coming. We got to get somewhere where we can sit down for the day because we're not going to be marching through it. You guys that think in terms of historical context do not understand the peoples, and it's important to understand the peoples as well, because no man marches day in and day out. He has to stop. He has to sleep. He has to drink, rest, recuperate. These are important things for any human, not just soldiers on campaign. And if you don't do that, you wear out. Ask a doctor. Ask a nutritionist. Ask somebody that understands these topics better than I. And you will see that I'm like going right down the middle here. And all the people that say about big, strong knights and armor and how they could do this, how they could do it, are all liars or pursuing false narratives that somehow they accepted without question when they were young and impressionable, or perhaps old and impressionable. Neo-revisionism is sick, and it's strong, and it pervades all the internet. So consider that. Your sources are often corrupt. Even my sources are corrupt because nobody knows everything. Me. And certainly not Eshkalar, though he could use wishes and alter reality and find things out that I couldn't dig. So anyway, now one of your peasants is walking downstream there, and he comes to a fairly broad, flat spot, and it looks like there might be a ford here, and all he has to do is like step over these logs that are laying on the side of the river there and go look at the spot that he sees up ahead. Looks like we can cross these. There's mud, and these logs are laying on the side of the river. He steps over one, and then he walks up to another one, and it opens his mouth. It's a crocodile. 12, 15, 18, 20 feet. And it goes, whoa, because crocodiles do that. They gape, right? And now we're going to go into a little bit of biology for you guys. It didn't have enough for me insulting you about parasites and malnutrition. I'm going to go another step. Crocodiles have an extremely slow digestion. Anybody out there know this? Because I bet a bunch of you do. You've watched it. Nature, National Geographic, these guys also. Crocodiles have very slow metabolism. They won't tell you it that way. But they'll say a crocodile can live for months off of one kill. That's the same thing, the slow metabolism. You're not like a lion that has to eat 50 pounds of meat a day, 30 pounds of meat a day. You are like a crocodile that has to eat at least twice, maybe 3 times a year. And you'd like to eat more often than that. But I'm guessing that crocodiles are like some people in society. Crocodiles would love to eat more, but they know they won't feel good if they do. And some crocodiles are gourmands and they just stuff their face anyway. Right? And some crocodiles are like, oh, I don't want to digest another pelvic girdle. Please, no. You know, I'll eat some more rocks. Oh, 2 months from now, it's going to have an effect. So, that crocodile is extremely slow. I have a point here. Extremely slow metabolism. And that means in its gut, essentially, meat is rotting away. What does meat produce as a product of rot? There are several things. There are putrescine, you know. What was that stuff that they found on Venus? They thought everything was alive because something was rotten in Venus. Something's rotten in Venus. It was another byproduct of putrescence. And that'll appear. And several other byproducts of the breakdown of proteins will appear. But a big, big component of the process of decomposition in a crocodile's belly is the production of methane gas. Now, if you know about methane from today's narratives, you'll know methane, the fuel of the future. Who will be the first to get their rocket to use methane? Can we use methane in jets? Because look at the power density of methane. And it's also low vapor pressure. It's all these benefits. It stinks like, oh, you wouldn't believe. But because it's mostly associated with other biotics and putrescines and whatnot. Not always. Of course, if methane comes out of the ground. And as far as I know, it might be odorless and colorless, and they got to add something to it so you know it's there. But still, methane is generally an unpleasant stuff, around humans especially. If you blew methane into a room, they would not be happy with you. Those that survived would be chasing you with weapons. So, methane is bad. But this croc's digestion is very slow, and its belly is full of methane. So when it goes, oh, in surprise, at this peasant with the torch looking at the log, what happens? Well, methane is ejected. What happens when methane hits air and a torch? Fire-breathing dragons. Of course. Wait, you thought there was something else going to happen? Who knows? There might be fire from the other end as far as I know. But for sure, a blue with orange sides jet of flame. Right, like when you light your stove. Yeah. So the peasant's like, ah, and either gets his face fried, right, because he's holding the torch like this. Maybe his face gets fried and he dies because Croc gets hold of him. That's the end of that peasant. And what the people along the river see, what the knights see waiting, you know, somebody's got their horse and the knights are like waiting to see what's going on. They see like, they hear somebody go like, what the woof? They see this jet of flame and they hear somebody scream. And then a bunch of activity, huge amount of activity, big lizards of some kind, you know, giant lizards, like scrambling all along the beach. Everybody's like, ah, they all turn around and run away. All the horses freak because nobody's seen a crocodile before. So there's a way to look at a myth, a narrative, and bring sense to it. If you say again, but look at the drawings of dragons, they got wings and 4 legs, and they're giant, and they got horns. Those are all commissioned by people that had narratives to promote. Just like the picture of all those armies in the medieval pictures, and everybody's got the best, finest 15th century plate armor in 1100 AD, when nobody had plate armor. And also in 1500 or 1560, when it seems like everybody's got that kind of armor, no, only a few lords and nobles had it because it's expensive as a Testarossa. It's as expensive, a suit of armor like that is as expensive as a Lamborghini. You buy a combat-ready set of armor. It's a huge investment in your periods and your kingdoms' modes of exchange. It's an enormous expense, or else everybody would have one. Like everybody has a car. Most people don't need a car. But everybody has one because the rich people says you got to have a car. It's like armor. Rich people are like, oh, everybody's got to have a set of armor, but you can't have one because I need that blacksmith making rivets for mine, day in and day out. He doesn't have time to make more armor for you. Riveting a set of armor. Every time you use it, some of those rivets pop. Especially if you're doing rolls on the ground like the guys on the internet. Look how good this is. Yeah, yeah. And now you have to go over your armor. Your armor has to look through it and fix all those rivets that popped. So armor isn't a you put it on and you're invulnerable and it lasts forever thing. Armor is a very specific suit of protection, rather like a fighter plane or a Bradley APC. Right. It isn't a Gundam. Never was. And you guys that promote that narrative that the knight in armor is invulnerable because nobody ever shoots at the horse are fools. Literally. Fools. A fool is a person who loves intemperately against the proof of his senses. And that's what you are. You're loving a subject, which we all love. I love the armored knight. Man, wow, with a nasal helm and a big battle axe, and nobody could stop me. Yahoo! Until a guy stuck me with a spear, goes right through my chain. Only about that much of it. That's enough to kill me. Only about this much of it. Oh, yeah. What happened to poor King Harry? Was he wearing plate armor? No, he was wearing maybe a little bit of chain back in 1066. And he's probably the only guy, him and his Huscarls, the only guys that had any kind of organized armor at all, because the rest were farmers, traders. The people that had armor were the Vikings, and even the Vikings were armored like bandits, pieces of this and pieces of that, because Vikings were bandits. Many of them read the stories. Many of them were thrown out of their homelands because they got into it with the king or with the local lord. And so they were forced to flee. Do you flee in full sets of armor with all your supplies? No, you just jump on the frickin' boat and get the hell out of there. So the Viking raiders that were like coming to the coast of England were on their last legs too. And they were desperate. And of course they would raid and take all the stuff they didn't have and then take it back home and say, like, can I please land and trade all these goods that you guys don't have? Look at this temple stuff. Oh, it's a nice gold. You want some? And of course the monks have wine and beer and ale. That's what monasteries did. They made their own wine and beer and ale and they sold it, and that's how they made money until the kings took all their lands away. Oda Nobunaga was such a king, by the way. Took all the monasteries' lands away because the monasteries were living in the carnal world. They weren't living in the spiritual world. And in England, they weren't living in the spiritual world either. They were living in the carnal world. They had a very obsessive set of rules, but some people like that. Some people have to order people's lives, or else they'll never be happy, or else they're not content. And those people have broken souls, and they usually rise to high power because, or those few that are at high power come from their ranks, I should say. So your fire-breathing dragon is pretty easy to describe. The fact that knights didn't wear armor is pretty obvious to anybody that looks at the picture of the times without looking at the artists who were commissioned by nobles and partisans to create these false visual narratives, or just did it because it was cool. Like if I drew a picture, if I decide I'm going to draw an assault on a castle, it's just some assault on some castle. So there'd be armored knights, and there'd be chain armored, and there'd be metal armored, and there'll be Roman ballistae, and there'll be, dragons, and there'll be, because that's what artists do. There are artists that chronicle real events and real things, and their paintings are mostly very boring. Go look at, you won't be able to access them anymore, but old American Heritage magazines. They used to be hardbound. You get American Heritage book, right? Very thin, but full of these beautiful paintings of battles. And here are Hooker's troops, and here are McClellan's troops, and you see them as lines and little puffs of smoke, and all very easy to read. That's what happens when you try to be historical about things. Well, Blucher was here on this hill, and that hill looked like this, and there were two roads, and I'm going to draw all that, and then draw these little lines of men. It's pretty boring looking. Even big paintings of it, pretty boring looking. But that's how you do history. But a king like rising up like this, and and like all the people around him, that's not history. That's Hollywood narratives. I think I'm done. I've insulted the people that the Knights and Armor fanboys. I've insulted the Dragon fanboys. They were always wrong. Dragons are. I already explained what they're from. You're either misinterpreting the fossil record, which is easy to do, or somebody is and spinning a narrative because people have a reason for spinning narratives, some of which are absolute lies. Right? I'll sell you the Brooklyn Bridge. Well, you don't own it. You don't know that. So that's a narrative. So I'm done with that. Eshkalar would have done it better, but he hasn't been seen since, two Saturdays ago. This has been Wild Bill, Senior Political and World Affairs Correspondent for Barbarian Armor Radio, filling in for missing Eshkalar in an addendum for missing persons. Thank you for listening.